Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Catholic Converts, aka Emily Torres, and I am here today with somebody that I've been following for a little bit of time now, and I'm super interested by all the content he's putting out there and just his story. So I'd love to introduce the gay ex-trad, or Cade is your first name. Is
hmm
that correct?
Yep. Cade
Awesome.
Bradley or Gay Extrad. One's my handle, one's the username. I go by both, depends on the day of the week.
Awesome. So could you just maybe share a little bit about yourself, the type of content that you're putting out there, and anything else you might be relevant to my audience?
hmm Yeah, so my background is sort of growing up nominally Catholic, going to church most weekends, but it was never a particularly devout Catholic childhood that I had. And then into early high school, I got deep into Catholicism, reading just about every book from Catholic Answers, going down the Latin Mass rabbit hole, listening to Taylor Marshall through all of COVID, wanted to become a traditional Catholic priest. That ended up not happening. So I still went out then to college to pursue my degrees in theology and philosophy at a small Newman Guide Catholic college. Loved it out there, but dropped out for business reasons. I work in the film industry. And then it was 3 years ago when I was 20, I was sort of reevaluating my beliefs. I wanted my beliefs and the strength of them to match up to the evidence. Read back through all of my books on the shelf, going through all the apologetics. I've always been a huge theology nerd, ended up leaving Catholicism. And then about a year and a half ago, started doing YouTube content online, sharing about my journey, some of my thoughts on Catholicism as an intellectual endeavor and as a personal story. And have gotten to debate a lot of prominent people and a lot of fun people that are also deep into the weeds on theology. And now I'm here talking to you after a few months of trying to align schedules. We are
I know.
both busy, but we finally made it happen.
Yeah, awesome. I'm so happy you're here, Cade. Okay, so the episode is really 10 questions that I'm asking an ex-Catholic, and I think you are the perfect person for this. So, all right, I just want to get to know you a little bit more. Your story just like really touched my heart, to be honest. I listened to a lot of your podcast episodes, and I am a fan of a lot of the dialogue that you're kind of putting out there that I don't think is talked about enough in the Catholic world, in the secular world. So yeah, I was really excited just to be able to talk with you. Okay, so first question, pretty easy. What is your favorite movie?
I think my favorite movie from a cinematography side is going to be Skyfall, the James Bond movie. That
Nice.
was probably like the first like adult movie, or like because I grew up on Disney Channel movies, and then I
Yeah.
think Skyfall was my first like actual movie that I watched in theaters, shot by Roger Deakins. Absolutely loved the movie and how it looked. And then probably my favorite movie from the plot standpoint is going to be Interstellar. That the storytelling, the characters, the dialogue, everything in that movie's narrative is perfect. So those have got to be my top two favorite movies.
That's awesome. I just saw Hans Zimmer in concert,
Ooh.
so I was able to hear a lot of the Interstellar soundtrack live, and same with James Bond. It was insane. If they're touring around the country, so if like the music side of the production interests you, definitely go and see them because it was crazy. But that's awesome. Okay. Second question. Who do you think Jesus was?
Ooh. I tend to think that the historical figure of Jesus probably existed as a sort of academic and historical perspective. And I think beyond that, I don't know if we can have certainty about much of his life, who he was, who he said to be. The documents about his life come out so much later. I mean, we got Tacitus, we got Josephus, who seem to report that this figure existed. In a lot of ancient history go, if there's reports of somebody, they probably existed. But much beyond that, I don't think we can know much about his life. We seem uncertain when he was rumored to have been born, when he seemed to have died, what his ministry looked like. There's a number of different competing theories on that. Who he was he a first century magician and miracle worker? Was he the son of God? Was he a prophet of God? Those, I think, are interesting questions, but they seem to be shrouded in such mystery that I don't know if we can make certain claims about who he was or who he's said to be.
Okay, I'm interested on that. So, what standard, I guess, are you holding to? Like, would you apply that same logic to a lot of his like ancient historical figures,
Mhm.
or what standard, I guess, are you holding to confirm that something, we could have a good amount of certainty to believe somebody did something?
Yeah, so I think a lot of Catholic arguments around the person of Jesus are going to rely on, well, what standard do we use for other historical figures, right? Talking about, did Genghis Khan exist? Did many of the Roman emperors exist? So much of history is shrouded in mystery. And so honest historians often will sort of say, if we have a few data points about somebody, we can sort of assume that they are real for the sake of the narrative of ancient history, that we can't really have certainty about a lot of these historical figures, but we can reasonably say that they probably existed. And when it comes to Roman emperors, we tend to believe the accounts of when did they have their reign, what were some of the big things that they did while they were in power. But most historical figures also have these rumors that have developed about their miracles or how great of emperors they were, or just how widespread somebody like Genghis Khan was. And we sort of go, if it's a rather mundane thing that we know probably generally happens, like a Roman emperor existed, we sort of have a much standard and much more lower bar to say, well, yeah, that probably happened. But in the same account, even from the same historians, if we go, and that Roman emperor flew into battle on whatever, we go, yeah, that probably didn't happen because we know, generally speaking, that people don't ride into battle on very large birds. Though that would be very cool. And so I think the same thing with Jesus applies here, which is the evidence for him existing as a person in history is about equal to other historical figures that we assume exist. And his miracle claims are not any stronger than a lot of other miracle claims throughout history, miraculous accounts. We disbelieve a lot of those other miracle stories. I think with the figure of Jesus, I was actually just writing a script on why I don't particularly believe that the resurrection happened, is because we know that these more far-fetched tales without priors probably didn't happen, so we need a much higher bar for anybody to have miraculous claims, even if these people have miraculous and non-miraculous claims intermixed as a matter of the historical record.
Awesome. Okay, I would love to keep talking about this. I really want to. Maybe, okay, one last question, I guess, as a follow up. What are you going to say the standard is then for believing in a miracle?
I think it's going to come down to the particular claim. I don't know if I'd make this grand distinction between miracles and non-miracles, because as soon as we see that something is observed through the scientific process, that is sort of natural by definition, even if we don't fully realize how that happened or what happened. So I think in a sort of pedantic sense, everything that has happened in history has happened, which is, like mind-blowing. I don't know if I'd have this big distinction between miraculous and non-miraculous claims. Um, I think the more far-fetched a claim is, we're probably going to want to have a higher evidentiary bar. Like if the figure of Jesus had written things during his lifetime might have been helpful. If our accounts of the resurrection were much closer to the events that had happened, if we had um, outside historical voices that had confirmed his death, that would be quite helpful. If the claims of his resurrection aren't just allegedly hearsay, which is like a lot of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John probably weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they were probably proximate to eyewitnesses. So it's hearsay in a sort of technical sense. Maybe if we could actually get those first person accounts would have been helpful, would make it more likely. But because the claim is that a man truly died and was dead for multiple days, and we don't have priors for somebody resurrecting like that, um, we're gonna need a lot more than Tacitus and Josephus and some secondhand accounts of first-hand accounts happening through an anonymous author.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for
Mhm.
sharing your response on that. Okay, and third question. What is one thing that the Catholic Church does well, in your opinion, and what is one thing that it could do better?
I think for so many people, the Catholic Church is a amazing force for meaning in people's lives. I think of young converts like I once was, not that I'm old, at least hopefully I'm not old at all of 23. Um, but I remember being part of this young zealous movement, getting into apologetics. I remember feeling so lost in middle school, in public schools, and I was like looking for my home. I was looking for meaning. I was looking for the big answers to these questions in life. Why are we here? What comes after this? How ought we act while we're here? And I think it's that drive that the Catholic Church can provide so many compelling answers to. And I remember being part of the movement, beautiful liturgy. I still remember going to the Latin Mass for the first time and almost crying because of how beautiful it was on the Feast of All Saints at the All Saints Parish in Minneapolis by the FSSP. Beautiful work of culture and art and ceremony and ritual. And so I think the Catholic Church provides such tremendous meaning for people. And that's something that I never want to take away from people. I am not pro deconversion or telling people that they must deconvert. But I think on the same token, because it provides such incredible meaning for people's lives, such incredible peace that surpasses all understanding, it's something that we must be careful of, that we don't see the meaning that we have in our lives, as something that everyone else must follow or to force it upon each other. Or even though families and communities can be built around a common narrative, they can just as easily be torn apart. And I've seen families ripped apart because of these religious differences. And so in many ways, there's strengths to having this communal meaning. And I think sometimes that can go too far. And I've encountered a lot of people that have been tremendously damaged, that other people have found meaning and either force them in or force them out of the family for not taking part in that same beautiful work of culture and narrative and literature and art.
Yeah, no, I would say I agree with you on a lot of that. I think it's very delicate when you are not like this is coming from somebody who none of my family is Catholic, right? And when you're in that position, it's really easy to isolate yourself, to look down on other people in your life who like, you're thinking, "Oh, they don't understand the truth the way that I do." And that can just cause some distance. So part of like what I've had to have to unlearn is that. And thanks be to God, like I've been Catholic, I think officially for over 4 years now. So
So,
like it took a while. I have an identical twin sister, and actually at the same time that I was converting, she was deconstructing and falling away from Christianity as a whole. And so like that bond that we had as like identical twin sisters, that was definitely shaken by our differing worldviews at this point. And this was 4 years ago. And yeah, so it took a lot of time to really learn how can we like coexist, even though we have vastly different views of how we should live our lives, what really matters, what's right, what's wrong. How can we coexist, and not even just coexist, but love one another through that, despite that. And I think that's an art that a lot of people, especially in the Catholic Church, need to learn how to master. I mean, myself included. But yeah, thanks for sharing
it,
that.
it, and many people who are leaving religion as well. There are a lot of people who are leaving religion or look down on religion that can also cause harm to people who have found something incredible about their lives. Where I know people that'll look down as somebody joins a religion as, gosh, this person isn't educated. This person doesn't know how to look at arguments. This is so unreasonable. And can, in the same manner, force that upon somebody else or to look down upon somebody else. I was just talking to one of my close friends who feels like I have, in his own personal life, confirmed him in his faith, because even though I do a lot of internet commentary and certainly share a lot of my thoughts out there, almost nobody in my real life knows what I think about religion, even though I've studied this for almost a decade at this point, and certainly have plenty of thoughts and am very vocal on the internet about them. In real life, all of my religious friends will wish me a happy whichever religious holiday from their tradition. I have many non-religious friends who will also reach out. That I choose to see the world as everyone is perfect as they are, not in some like moral sense or that people don't harm other people. But I don't desire for my friends in real life who go to church to stop going to church. I think it is incredibly dangerous in a relationship to want to change somebody who is unwilling to change in both directions. To see, I know a lot of people that their parents are still religious and they want to pull them out of that. And it's like, no, that is your parents' life. That is their community. That is how they see the world. And it is disrespectful and harmful to try to pull them out in the same way that I think when I first converted, it was like, I have found something amazing that has made my life better. I have found this, this pearl in the field, and I've sold everything to go after it. And I think even when I was a convert, was a little bit too pushy in my public high school, telling everyone that I knew about Jesus. And I think there's a certain like, there's that zeal that I meet a lot of people and even talk to people who have converted just this Easter, the last one, and they're still on fire in that sort of young convert zeal. And I love that for them. And also I've sort of been like, there will be a time, regardless if you stay Catholic or leave Catholicism or whatever it is, where you realize that like maybe the world's a little bit more complex than we thought it is. And I think that's an important thing for people on both sides of these discussions, to realize that your family members and your friends have really thought about this, and your family and friends are good at thinking. And you thinking that you can change somebody in like 15 seconds, or just I'm going to give them that argument and it's going to work, is insulting to family members, because they've thought about it for more than 15 seconds. So give people the grace on both sides.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Very well put. I totally agree with that. Okay, so I guess this is kind of going into some things you've mentioned. So based off of what I was listening to from your content, it seemed like you're a nominalist. Would you ascribe that view to yourself?
It depends on the day of the week. Is sort of as the joke goes about lawyers, where every answer is it depends. I think a lot of things since leaving Catholicism, where my philosophy is very dependent on the question being asked. When it comes to nominalism or realism, I tend to take a sort of hermeneutic indifferentism approach, which is to say that I don't know if I make claims about the ontology or the taxonomy of various things in existence out there in the world. I think when we say like, can you repark the red car that's out on the street? Hermeneutic indifferentism takes the position that hermeneutic, which is to say we're sort of communicating something here, which is similar to fictionalism, in that do red cars exist as sort of like this thing out there in the ether? When you're talking to somebody, most people haven't thought that deep. So it's sort of a figure of speech that communicates something to another person. And then the indifferentism part, which is the average person isn't sort of trying to figure out, like, are there sets or are there universals of red cars? It's just like, awesome, yes, mom, I will move the red car in the driveway, versus this big statement about nominalism and realism, whether that's in morality or metaphysics or whatever it is. So it's my very long-winded approach to say, kind of, but hermeneutic indifferentism would be the technical thing that I might take.
Okay, interesting. I haven't heard that view espoused before. So I'm also like not super big on epistemology, but okay. So that was just like a preface to the question.
Mhm.
So it seemed like in some of the episodes I was listening to that you have a big appreciation for using the scientific method as a means to investigating reality.
Mhm.
And my perspective on that is great. Like I agree, but I also don't take a position of like, we are kind of giving the purpose and the telos of an object, a body part, a function. We're not just like ascribing that however we see fit. There are like inherent telos or ends to items or
Mhm.
body parts or whatever. So I'm curious to hear how you kind of reconcile. To me, it seems like there's tension there. Do you see what I mean? Of like, we're using empirical lens to investigate the world using science. But if that's true, then that would mean we can't ever get to 100% certainty in a scientific conclusion if we're simply going off of observation and appearance and not the very essence of something. Was
Mhm.
that clear?
Yeah, I think in all of philosophy, in these big questions about life, you can ask why a great number of times, and then at a certain point, everyone runs out of answers, right? The kids growing up will often ask, like, well, why do we have stoplights? And a parent might give a response, and then you ask why again, and like you might have a layer deeper, and then the kid might ask why again, to like, why don't we want people to like have head-on collisions? And you sort of like, well, because it harms people. And then it's like, but like, why is harming people bad? And you're like, at a certain point, we all sort of have these first principles when it comes to logic, when it comes to how we know things, when it comes to morality, when it comes to philosophy. We all sort of have, at a certain step, first principles, which is like, how do you prove science from science? And the answer is, you can't really. But also, I think on the religious end, if we just sort of ground everything back into God, is a rhetorical sleight of hand, where I don't think that solves the same question, because it goes like, well, and how do we know that God exists? Well, we got these arguments. I'm like, how do we know this? Why? And then you sort of keep asking why, and at a certain point, there's a mystery there. And so I think on both sides of these conversations, religious, non-religious, and everything in between, we all sort of hit bedrock when it comes to how we know things. And so to answer your question in particular, when it comes to the scientific method, I think the scientific method is the closest thing we're going to get to objective certainty. Because if I can't prove gravity in my lab in Denver, or if I can do that, we want somebody in South Africa to be able to prove that and somebody to be able to replicate that 10 years from now. And that sort of gives us much more confidence, for lack of a better term. You can ask why, and the answer is like, well, is truth sort of predictive utility? It would seem like it. And if you ask like why a layer deeper, it's like, I don't know, man, like we just do science. And I think so science is going to be one of the more potent forms, I think, of knowing truth. But also, like, when you go to court, you can't scientifically prove that somebody was speeding when you go to traffic court, because you can't rewind in time. So we have different levels and burdens of proof in the legal system, right? If a cop wants to stop you on the street, they just need reasonable, articulable suspicion, which some judges will say, like, it's more likely than not in a certain sense, or like it's somewhat warranted. And then in civil court, it is preponderance of evidence, which is more likely than not. And then in criminal court, there's beyond a reasonable doubt. And so in the legal system, we're not as certain as science, but we certainly make decisions off of that limited certainty. And then you sort of move into medicine and economics and all these things. And like our doctors are less certain about a diagnosis than maybe some court cases, and the court cases are less certain than science. And so we sort of have degrees of less and less certainty, but we still hold to them because that's as close as we can get. And I think we can all point out that we have different confidence levels in different things. And so it's like, am I 100% confident in not having 100% confidence about the scientific method? Is it sort of like, that's a great gotcha when it's sort of like youth group level apologetics. But in a serious academic sense, it's like, we all run into that issue, whether we're religious or not. We sort of have to take first principles for granted. We want to think well, and we want truth and our belief claims to match up to the evidence that's out there. And I see religious truth, not as a literal claim about history. I think something can be true in a religious setting from a narrative standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from a spirituality standpoint. I think truth is a very, very diverse thing, and science is not the only way to truth. But I'm probably going to trust in gravity more than historical claims. I'm probably going to trust in evolution slightly more than the Council of Nicaea. And I'm probably going to trust a little bit more in a biopsy from a doctor than I am going to be in some debate in philosophy or epistemology. So to wrap that all in a bow, is like we have different levels of confidence. And I do joke that the only thing that I'm generally certain of is uncertainty. And am I certain of being uncertain? The answer is yes. And I am generally certain about being generally certain about generally certain, and ad infinitum about the propositions and how I see the world.
Okay, this is great. I wish I could just spend an hour talking about this. Okay, I'll give a few thoughts out there.
Yeah.
I will say I do agree. I do agree with your statement that we all sort of have these first principles, these intuitions that we have to start with in order to do philosophy, to think, period. But some are better than others, right? I mean, I'm sure you would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, though, I mean, my thing is like, so we'll get more into this, I guess, when we get into your sexual morality and ethics. But
Mm-hmm.
like, for example, if we're talking about sex, right? And you might say, well, sex can be whatever you want it to be. It can be for pleasure, it can be for intimacy, it can be for making a child, whatever, right? It's kind of what you ascribe for it. Would you take that same premise and apply that, for example, to some other bodily function, like digestion? Could digestion be whatever I want it to be? Or is there something inherent in digestion where scientists can study that overall concept and universal and be able to see digestion in you and somebody else across the world? And it's not just like a particular case where we have to examine it, look at another individual, figure that out for that person, right? How do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So I think the question that you're asked is a great question, and it's also slightly different than a scientific question. And I think when people are listening, philosophy can get really, really complicated and sound like it's just a bunch of like old men in rooms making up distinctions between things that don't exist for the sake of not having to go to work and be a productive member of society, which is slightly true in a certain sense. And as we get into these more complicated questions, there's sort of like the colloquial way that we use things, like this is for something, or scientists say that, getting hit by a car is bad for your health, or sort of like onion type of headlines. There's sort of like a common way that we speak. And then there's a slightly more technical version when it comes to philosophy. So when it comes to the scientific method, we can talk about how science works when it comes to epistemology, which is how we know things, about truly scientific propositions, which is X might lead to Y, or when we change this independent variable, this other thing changed. But if we want to talk about the biology and body parts and digestion, we can absolutely go there. But I do want to sort of if we want to go into that realm, slightly shift the conversation to ask the questions on sexual morality, just so people don't sort of get confused where common parlance and how we normally talk about things. Like I normally don't talk about this nerd stuff. Like if I'm at my parents' house and it's like, mom's like, clean up the dishes. They're sort of, well, like, do dishes have ontology? And is there a moral ought? It's just like, man, like I'm going to clean the dishes if I'm visiting my parents. So we can absolutely move into sexual morality and the digestion questions if you want to, but is there any specific like scientific and epistemological things before we move into that?
Yeah, so I guess so would you say that mathematical truths can take us closer to objective reality than scientific truths?
Um, Technically speaking, math is one of the only fields that we can have proof in sort of a technical way, because when it comes to math, we're sort of defining all of the terms into existence and building internal coherence. And each of those numbers are discrete. Right, like talking about significant figures for all of the chemistry people out there. It's like, is it 1 or is it 1.00000 repeating for forever? Are both 1, but there's different levels of degree. So if we take math and say 1 means just 1 and not 1.004, but we round it to 1, but like 1 plus 1 equals 2. We've sort of defined integers. The integers are discrete. And all that we need to know 1 plus 1 equals 2 is sort of internal. And so we can do mathematical proof. In nearly everything else in science, even though people might say is scientific proof, technically it's evidence, so that there's a slight distinction. But math is one of the only fields where we can sort of have proof and 100% confidence because we define the system. Everything else is going to be slightly more technical and not 100% beyond any conceivable doubt. So the answer to your question is yes. And also in the middle of any of my answers, feel free to jump in because I can go off on just about anything. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm glad you said that because I was just thinking of Hume and I was thinking about, he's going to say mathematical truths because by their very definitions, they prove something, right? They're number one. But his problem of induction, how do you get around that? I mean, are you just going to agree with him that we can't have certainty about anything that science really proves?
Yeah. So I put it this way. Since leaving Catholicism, I have seen philosophy more as therapy for our intuitions rather than being able to prove things in like a technical stance. So I see sort of these conversations around metaphysics and epistemology as great thought exercises, as ways that help us think better about the world, to see around corners, right? Like what is ethics other than sort of really thinking about like, in the healthcare field, there are really complicated decisions, and we want to zoom out and see the big picture, and we want to zoom in, and we want to have really good conversations. And so when it comes to Hume's sort of idea, which is, let's say we see 10,000 red apples, are we warranted, or can we have confidence that the 10,001st apple is also going to be red? Or when it comes to how do we know that the sun is going to rise? In a very technical sense, I can't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, like beyond any conceivable doubt, right? Us getting hit by an asteroid from outer space made of dark energy is technically possible. But in a certain sense, and I say this to myself as a philosophy nerd, is there's a sort of like, man, like, shut up and stop being such a nerd is like what I say to myself when it comes to these like really technical discussions, which is like, how do we know about the self? It's like, we can think about that, but at a certain point you go like, yeah, man, anyways, we got to get to work and like have a life here. Because I love these technical discussions, but I don't think we can magically solve Hume's problem of inductions. Or how do we know that all swans are white? It's like, well, I mean, if we've exhausted and looked all across the world at swans, if we know what causes pigmentation, if we get rid of albinism in swans, I think like if we had never seen black swans nowadays, we could be warranted in saying every swan's going to be white. But before we traveled the world, right, like we did find black swans. Or with apples, there are green apples. So I think there's a bunch of technical distinctions that we can make in there. But in the most technical sense, how do I know that we're not part of a simulation? It's like, I don't know. I'm going to love my family members and do fun things and make good moral decisions, even if this is all ran by Elon Musk at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that just be normal. Just be
Hmm.
normal. We don't have to sit and question every small decision that we're making and figure out the logical premises behind it.
Hmm.
We just have to act, you know?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, so we will get into the sexual ethics.
hmm,
Maybe put it on pause for a second.
copy.
Some less heavy topics. Okay, what would your death row meal be?
Ooh, it's probably going to be Annie's mac and cheese. It's not going to be anything crazy. It's either going to be Annie's mac and cheese or perhaps fogo de chao, that bacon wrapped chicken, Brazilian grill. Oh, so good. Also Annie's mac and cheese, incredible. I purposely don't keep it in my house because I love mac and cheese too much. Um, if I'm not intentional about food, I do end up eating like a 12-year-old. So I have to be very intentional about actually getting my veggies in, and not being a philosophy nerd who eats like a 12-year-old. It is, once again, like we talked about, I do have to remind myself to be normal at some point.
Next question. We're on number 6 right now. Do you think that modern atheists can do the same thing with evolution that Catholics do with natural law in terms of their line of reasoning and, why humans, for example, I don't know, have an inclination to procreate or why we love beautiful things or any sort of thing along that line?
Are you saying that there might be a similarity in the underlying philosophy, or from like a marketing standpoint,
Okay,
who can be
sorry.
more effective?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, for example, if you ask a Catholic, why do human beings innately desire beautiful things? Why do we have this, draw towards something that's symmetrical and something that is more calming in colors? And our response might be that human beings innately desire God and God is beauty, whatever, right? And somebody that's an atheist who denies the existence of God might respond, "Oh, evolutionarily speaking, human beings, looked at a sunset and saw the beautiful colors and knew that that was time for rest and yada yada." There's some sort of reverse reasoning, if you know what I mean. Like
Hmm.
you're sort of starting from the premise, "Oh, God doesn't exist. Let me think of a reason why, from a survival standpoint, we might desire these things." Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. Um, I think my biggest epiphany since leaving Catholicism is that the world, is a lot more non-binary, not to use a sort of gender term in the middle of this, that it's not sort of, right, Christianity or atheism, it's sort of binary, like this or
Yeah.
that. And so to say non-binary, I don't mean dyeing your hair blue and getting on Fox News. What I mean is that there's infinitely more complex steps when it comes to, right, is morality objective or subjective? There's about 30 schools of thought in there. When it comes to sort of like why are humans drawn to beauty, there's a lot more steps between a Bishop Barron's sort of reflection on the latest Star Wars movie and like Matt Dillahunty going crazy on his show about how dare someone believe in God. That there's a lot of steps in between. And I also think sort of my second epiphany since leaving Catholicism is that having an answer that sounds correct or has explanatory power isn't the same as that thing being true. Because I'm somebody that really wants to make sense of the world. And I think a lot of people who are neurodivergent like really want definitions to things and like concrete and ask why and like want an answer. And so I think the sort of God answer, which is the transcendental arguments for God, truth, goodness, and beauty, and God has made us with souls so as to worship Him and to recognize the beauty of His natural creation, hearkening back to the first paragraph of the Catechism of the Catholic Church of God out of a plan of pure love and wanting to share in the goodness of creation. And I'll try to not recite the entire Catechism. Like that answer sounds compelling, and the atheist answer, which is, or the evolutionary biologist that says, well, our brains are sort of glucose hungry machines. Our brains really love shortcuts. And so beauty sort of tickles our brain because it's an evolutionary adaptation to not spend all of our brain power, all of the sugar in our brain, trying to go through every single photon coming through our iris. And so beauty is sort of an aesthetic thing because it allows our brain to recognize big things, but with little computational power. That sounds uninviting. That answer sounds cold. That answer sounds like, but surely there's got to be more to it. And the answer is like, yeah, absolutely. We can only know partial truth in comparison to an answer that sounds really compelling. And so I've also found, and I've actually just was writing a script while I've been out sort of on hiatus recently, which is that like I don't think atheism has explanatory power. I don't think that atheism like is a thing. In many ways, if somebody's going to an AA meeting, it's like, how do I have a meaningful life without this particular drug? The answer is like, not being sober is not the answer to your problems. Or I talk to people when they're coming out, and it's like coming out doesn't solve all of your life's problems. In the same way, like leaving religion, and if somebody's listening thinking of leaving religion doesn't make your life perfect. Leaving religion doesn't make your life meaningful. Leaving religion doesn't explain the world. It's a sort of starting line. And so when it comes to these big questions about life, the answer is not atheism. The answer is something beyond that, because atheism is sort of unhelpful navel gazing, but really only exists in comparison to a belief system that is trying to be imposed. So that's like my like 12 layered multi-veiled answer to what is seemingly a normal question. So as I said earlier, when I said with philosophy, at a certain point, it's like sort of like, shut up, man, like be normal. Like that's what I have to tell myself, and my friends tell me a lot. So that is not a slight against my fellow philosophy and theo bros out there.
Awesome. So, okay, just to clarify,
hmm
do you think the same way that people can God-splain, people
hmm
science-splain, you know,
Oh,
from,
100%.
you know? Okay.
Yeah, you go on some diet, or you go to a gym and they're like, this particular workout plan is scientifically proven. And it's like, man, like you just like the music here at the gym. Like you like rock climbing, and then you sort of backfill with scientific studies. That's like rock climbing is cool. And like I live in Colorado. I love being in the mountains doing rock climbing as much as the next person. But I think when it comes to evolutionary psychology, if anybody says according to evolutionary psychology, your answer should be turn off your phone, because they're probably lying to you. In the same way that there are people who, when they go, the Holy Spirit put it on my heart to tell you X, Y, and Z, the answer is like, that sounds probably, I don't know if the Holy Spirit's telling you that I need to brush my teeth. It's probably just you telling me that I need to brush my teeth, not the Holy Spirit.
It's always the most diabolical statement that follows after that. It's like,
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, so now we're getting into sexual ethics. So maybe just start with what, in your mind, makes what conditions need to be met in order for a sexual action and encounter to be something that you would see as like permissible? And how does that include incest? And I would say particularly between like siblings of the same sex, for example. So there would be no offspring that could result from this sexual encounter. How would you respond to that based off the definition you provide?
So once again, this is where I go sort of ethics and meta-ethics nerd mode, which is to say that a lot of our moral conversations and how we use words right and wrong, in harm and objective and subjective, there's sort of like the there's sort of the way that we use those words if we're out at the bar. Last night I was out with friends. I don't drink, but I love going to the bar with friends. And people were talking about the church fathers after about 4 beers, because that tends to be all of my friend group. Right? We're talking about Anselm and Tertullian, who technically isn't a church father. Separate discussion. But all to say, there's sort of how we use words in normal conversation. Right? If somebody cuts me off in traffic, I'm going to say that's wrong. But if we want to have a technical discussion, which is on like ethics and applied ethics and meta ethics, and morality overall, we're going to have to use more technical words than right or wrong, or what sort of necessary and sufficient conditions make an act permissible. Because in a very Jordan Peterson way, it's like, what precisely do you mean by permissible? Is a valid question to ask when it comes to this. So what I tend to answer moral questions are, unless we have sort of 2 hours to do a crash course into the modern state of ethics, which is a very dynamic field that religion doesn't have a monopoly on, is that I'm going to shift the words from like what things are permissible or what things are right or wrong when it comes to sexual ethics, and just replace that word entirely with what actions are harmful or not harmful is one example. Not saying that right and wrong are synonymous with harm, but if somebody's asking the question, it's like, so what things are harmful and not harmful? Well, it seems like we sort of have this intuition. It seems like the data has this borne out. And it seems like a good idea that consent is the starting point of sexual ethics. Not that anything that is consensual is ergo fine or good for someone. But that's the grounding that I think we can all arrive to the conversation, which is like things must be consensual. That only adults who have proper faculties are able to give full consent to these particular acts. But I think Catholics rightly point out, and that I think some ethicists often glance over, is like, just because something doesn't cause harm or something is legal doesn't mean that it's good for you, right? I can think of, you go to the doctor and you can ask them all sorts of horror stories about people that have done things that are legal and not harmful and consensual and still has a lot of deleterious health effects. And so, to use a quote from a friend of mine, which is like, not everything that is permissible is life-giving. So we sort of have this bar, which is what is legal, which is consenting adults in the privacy of their own home or with other consenting adults. But if we want to have a more technical conversation, which is like, how ought people act, or what leads to long-term happiness, what leads to stable relationships, what leads to a good society, that's going to be a different set of questions when it comes to psychological health, when it comes to societal health, when it comes to how the legislature is able to act on these questions. So it's infinitely more complex than I think the question that you're answering, which is my very politician answer to a very simple question, because I love ethics and we can get into it. And this all sounds like a giant dodge, which in a certain sense it is, because that question sort of goes into like 4 or 5 different really big questions that we can certainly get into and you can press me on. So there's that answer. Do you want to move into a technical conversation on incest, or do you want to jump in before I keep on steamrolling off into that realm?
Oh, no, we can jump into incest, but which sounds horrible,
Chat,
but
clip that.
yeah, no, literally, don't clip that and just post that segment.
That's the trailer.
Before we do that, though, I'm curious, by adults, would you say that that's 18 and up? Like, if it's like 2 16-year-olds, like what are your thoughts on that? I'm out of curiosity.
Yeah, so consent is going to come down to the mental faculties to recognize somebody's situation and the pros and cons of a given action, which is a really long-winded way to say, I can't even talk anymore. That if I were in charge of the government, 2 16-year-olds sort of have similar mental development. And so I wouldn't say that is statutorily unconsensual. So we don't get you banned off of YouTube. That consent is often going to come down to power dynamics, mental development, which is where like a therapist, a client of a therapist or a client of a doctor is not able to give consent to that particular act because of the power imbalance, even though they are adults. In the same way that if somebody has mental handicaps or is developmentally delayed, even if they reach the age of 18, doesn't mean ergo they are capable of giving consent to anyone. That from a legal standpoint, depending on the state, also according to if we talk about sort of canon law and how the church prosecutes cases of consensual and unconsensual breaking of priestly vows, consent is more complex than anybody over 18 can do whatever. But generally speaking, in sort of an ethical conversation, when I say an 18-year-old or an adult, it's going to mean somebody who has full mental faculties, can understand what's happening, is comfortable saying no, and there isn't some crazy power dynamic that's weighing on it.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, let's dive into the incest question.
Mm-hmm. So I think in ethics, there's 3 layers to sort of moral conversations, which, it's very Thomas Aquinas of me, and I got a sumo right behind the couch there, even though I'm not Catholic anymore, is that Thomas Aquinas sort of answers every question with like, first, it can be said that blank, and then this, and then this. And so I'm going to sort of use that framework, which is to say that when we talk about ethical considerations, specifically on incest, there's sort of in principle, in praxis, and in practice are sort of 3 layers to an ethical consideration. So in principle is like devoid essentially of human limitations and human reality. There is moral questions. Then in praxis is sort of like in theory or in practice in a theoretical context, which is to say like we don't always have to right, if we're talking about the movie like The Purge, we don't have to sort of in practice do the purge to recognize that in practice it would be bad. So that's sort of what in praxis means with an X. And then in practice is like the lived reality, like if we passed a law that would allow it. So when it comes to a consideration like incest from a technical academic standpoint, right? Like in common parlance, if somebody asked me the question, the answer is absolutely no. In an academic context, the answer is still absolutely no, but in like three different ways. Um, to bring back to our conversation on consent, I don't think that people in a family are capable of giving consent to each other because of the power imbalance. I think that from a genetic component, we see in society we generally don't want children to be born with similar genetic relatives because that leads to suffering, which, whatever we want to say about it, is bad according to most meta-ethical theories. In practice, and in praxis, we also don't want it to happen because that would sort of ruin the sanctity of a family. To steal Trent Horn's conversations around sexual ethics, it's like you want to grow up in a family where you're not worried about siblings or parents hitting on you, and so I think we want to promulgate that as a society, and then we also sort of have the pragmatic concerns, which is like if that trust is violated, breakups get nasty. We don't want them in families. We don't want the genetic component. We don't want that to even be on people's radars as a society. We know that it leads to harm of offspring. It leads to harm of people that are participating in it, and that I don't think that it can be done in an ethical way. Which is also a slightly different question than if two different adopted children ended up in a relationship, would we prosecute that? There's sort of like the moral question. There's the epistemology of that moral act. And then there's the pragmatic concern of the government, which on top of already giving you three different answers to a basic question, then it's like, then we get to have three more answers on top of all of that. Is my really long-winded, like almost TED Talk level confusing gobbledygook of what is in common parlance a very easy question to say no to.
So if they were, for example, like twin brothers, how would there be a power dynamic there?
Twin brothers, raising in a family. So there's a few things here, right? When we talk about consent is both, there's power dynamics, and then there's also the ability to say no. In a family setting, there was a lot of pressure in families to maintain appearance, to go along with the thing, to protect family members. And so I think that the case of twins, I don't think consent can be established because in praxis and in practice, which is to say, like, sort of like in theory, you could try to make a technical case. I think in praxis and in practice, there is no situation in which we ever want to be trying to discern that question because of how strong families' ability to pressure people is, that consent has to be freely given. And I don't think in a family setting that can ever truly be freely given.
Okay, interesting. I mean, my initial thoughts are like, I can understand that argument, but I also could understand the flip side of like my sisters. I mean, this is a disgusting scenario, but like my
Mhm.
sisters and my family in general, they're the people that I'm realist with. Like my sister's like,
Mhm.
can you go, can I eat your leftovers? I'm like, no, like absolutely not. You cannot eat my leftovers.
Yeah.
Like, where it's like, if it's a stranger, especially if it's somebody that like I don't know very well, I want to impress them, I'd be like, yeah, sure. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I could see the flip side of like family, you can be the most real with your family and the most comfortable with your family than you could maybe with a stranger.
Yeah, there's certainly scenarios in which people are more real than most people. And I also know a ton of scenarios in which we all sort of, right, you come home with a report card from school and you tell mom and dad that you got all A's. Some of them might be A minuses, but they technically start with A. Or you go home for Thanksgiving, different relatives that sort of put you back into a box of who you were growing up. And I think that's also where sort of ethical conversations get really technical, and academic ethicists can get really crude and really reprehensible really quickly, because you could sort of make a theoretical consideration that at one point in somewhere in history, could someone have possibly not felt pressure? And the answer is like, yeah, man, like if you're a creep, you can write a book about that. But like in practice, the answer is like no. And also it's the same thing. Some people have talked to me about my conversation on Iron Inquisitor or Randall's channel about abortion, where I think that there's sort of a moral question and then there's a legal question. And I think those two are separate. And so I think so many moral quandaries and so many ethical, like weird things that you read about in the like ethics textbooks are solved by going like, do we want in the law that to exist? The answer is like no. Like we need to say as a blanket statement that cannot be consensual in the same way with doctors and with clerics and with therapists. Can you think of a scenario? Maybe. Do we even want to start that discussion? No, because as soon as you open that discussion, just by opening that discussion, you are causing harm in a certain sense, because then a victim has to prove and overcome a barrier other than whatever happened at the end of the day was wrong. That's the society that I want to live in. Talking about the real commentary, once again, to steal from Trent Horn, is that like you don't ever want those sexual considerations to enter those close relationships because of how often people misuse sex, which is like, oh, somebody's gonna clip me saying misuse because that's a colloquial use of use. We don't even want to start those conversations or have that enter the equation because dating's messy already. And as much as I love, I'm not going to go into an Alabama joke because I can come off as very offensive, but like dating is something that happens out there on the apps and with crazy exes, not what happens at family reunions. And does the theist, can they make a grander condemnation? The answer is like, yes. You can say from all of eternity, this is intrinsically wrong and this can never be justified because X, Y, and Z. And you can pontificate, which is funny in a Catholic context, about how wrong this is. And it feels compelling to have this be very, very, very wrong. And sometimes the non-theistic answer seems less compelling, but that doesn't make it less true. Because famously, depending on what Christian you talk to, you start doing well, how did Adam and Eve reproduce? You can go down the old papal documents on Adam and Eve being real people and how people were born in a genetic lineage. And I don't think that theism quite escapes the bad PR of having a meta-ethical conversation around incest on a technical podcast.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay, can I play devil's advocate? And this is sort of devil's advocate, but not really, because like I sort of believe these things, right? So what I'm hearing from you, which is good, I want you to be against incest because I think incest is disgusting, right? So I'm very happy about, I'm very happy we can agree on that. But like one argument I could see is like, let's not even open the discussion of the morality of same-sex relationships, because if that was legal and a lot of people in society started just making their families with a same-sex couple as their foundation, then, there goes the birth rate, there goes families coming from a natural origin. Dating happens on the apps. It doesn't happen in the locker room or on the cheer team or on the girls' basketball team. Could you make the case that if there were, and I haven't read the studies, and so I'm not making like a certain claim, but let's say there was something proven that people who are more inclined to same-sex attraction have a disproportionate number of being abused sexually as a child or something like that. If that were the case, which I don't know the numbers currently, so I'm not going to say that is or isn't true. Could we make that same claim that somebody who was violated as a child, who has these attractions towards something that, maybe is out of the ordinary, like if somebody's attracted to their sibling, that's creepy and weird, right? Could we make that same argument that like that maybe we can't allow that person to consent to a sexual act if it's coming from a place of past hurt, trauma, and there is a weird aspect to it, What would you say to that?
The answer to almost any technical ethical thing is that you can think of a counter scenario, right? You could think of a counterfactual ethical claim in nearly all situations. And I don't think theism or non-theism or any shade in between gets you out of sort of unfortunate moral hypotheticals, because though having God to ground your morality can sort of sound nice when you're talking to somebody about things being objectively wrong, it also means that if God had the laws a different way, the answer is that our deep moral intuitions about harm could be entirely wrong if God put out an update, right? If we say incest is wrong, which is a thing that I stand by, we do run into some very interesting things about how the first humans reproduced and onward. Or we talk about, well, what if God put out a proclamation? And I can hear you sort of shaking your head, because there is a lot of distinction between Catholic and Protestant technical ethics on God and morality and the relationship between
Yeah.
those two concepts. But the answer is, if we twist moral realism, but without a theistic base, the answer is like, yeah, you can get into crazy hypotheticals in the same way that God hypotheticals can get you into crazy scenarios as well. So to answer the question specifically on same-sex attraction, I tend to argue for an affirming culture from the brute fact, which is a certain percent of the population is going to be attracted to members of the same sex. That whatever the conversion therapists going on Lila Rose's show are going to say about the causes of same-sex attraction, whatever the horror stories about conversion therapy, like whatever we want to say about these studies, which the answer is that no, sexual trauma does not cause same-sex attraction, but that's not even where I start the argument, is that like, we know that a stable percent of the population will be attracted to members of the same sex, not as some passing thing, not as some very illegal act when it comes to something with a sibling, but as an orientation, as a human person. There are people that are stable and remarkably stable, lifelong, in being attracted to members of the same sex. And so I tend to go, so we have a decision to make that regardless about a hypothetical, this is real, that there are members attracted to the same sex in a, I just say healthy way, because we're already getting into sort of moral terms, but we can either affirm that or we can not affirm that, are sort of the two actions that we can take from this brute fact. And we know that by nearly every conceivable stat, people in society do worse under a non-affirming environment. And we know that people in society do better under an affirming environment. And so hypothetically, if you were in charge of choosing your own child's sexuality, it's sort of like one question. But once again, in praxis, is like, we know that's not the case. And so conversations around same-sex activity, you could certainly make the case like, oh, we don't even want to open that can of worms. But it's like, honey, like that can of worms is already open and has been for thousands of years. Just talk to the Greeks, as Joe Heschmeyer pointed out in our conversations. Like, this has always been happening, so let's deal with this. I find the incest question much more theoretical in something for a really cringy ethics textbook than it is for sort of common parlance and what's on our radar as a society.
Well, I mean, historically speaking, incest relationships were more normalized than same-sex ones. Like if
Mhm.
we're talking about cousins or something like that.
But they're not stable in orientation, because we don't see that people are permanently attracted to members of their family. Though in history, there's been plenty of harm that has come from that. That is not a sexual orientation, or at least one that has ever been explored in scientific literature, because it's really easy to coach people to walk more than like 20 miles from the neighboring like farm villages to like one over, so as to avoid accidentally marrying a cousin. But with same-sex attraction, it is remarkably stable for a good chunk of the population. And so I start that conversation out of we know that this is stable and exists and something we have to confront, versus the academic conversations around interfamilial sexual relationships aren't necessary in a theoretical, in praxis, or really even in practice type of way. But there's sort of an interesting hypothetical that ethicists talk about, but I don't think it's something that we're forced to confront, because generally, I don't know anybody who's ever been in that situation. And I think as a society, we sort of moved beyond that. And I hope we can establish world peace and nobody has to have that conversation. But we will always have to have the conversation around same-sex attraction.
So let's posit 200 years from now,
Mhm.
the existence of furries has skyrocketed. And many
It already
people,
has, if you've ever watched
oh,
Fox News.
oh yeah. And many people are becoming sexually attracted to their dogs.
It's not what being a
And
furry is, but we can take the hypothetical.
yeah, let's just say, all right, what's going to be your response to that? Like, it's becoming more normalized. Okay, we have to deal with this. 20% of the population, oh gosh, is attracted to their dog or their cat. How are we going to handle this now?
I am taking Elon Musk up on his offer to move to Mars and start civilization over again. Do I think that the flood of Noah happened? No, but if we get to the point where 20% of the population wants to unironically do that, I would hope then at that point that God exists and he can start civilization all over again. Um, which is sort of my joking dodge to a conversation around that. Um, and even if we do sort of take that in a very seriously unserious type of way, is that we know that that causes harm for the person, for society, and also for the animals. Whatever sort of, however we want to prosecute sort of animal suffering under whatever ethical system, however we want to prosecute a collapse of society, and however we want to prosecute harm to the individual. It is always bad to have intercourse with animals, and it's borne out in the literature. And I think that's what makes it so supremely distinct compared to healthy, long-term, same-sex romantic pairings are in such a different world, precisely because we know that it does not harm the individual, it does not harm society, and it does not harm the other people involved in a colloquial sense. Like, yes, are there complications to anything out there in the world? Yes, but in the same way that we don't say that like heterosexual relationships are inherently harmful, even though that harm can come from them,
Yeah.
is precisely the reason why we say, or at least that I say, that same-sex stable romantic pairings are harmless, with like an asterisk in the same way that straight relationships will have an asterisk there too.
So, okay, I understand what you're saying, and I
Mhm,
appreciate, and I'm not trying to make you like so I can clip you saying,
mhm,
yeah, bestiality is fine. I'm not trying to
mhm,
do that, but from your arguments, you're a consequentialist. Seemingly, you're saying that we see the studies, we see that this isn't harmful to society for two members of the same sex to come together in a long lasting relationship. That's what the data is showing. We have to do something about it because it's a present reality. Great, but like 200 years from now, let's say people like their dog to engage in oral sexual acts with them. The dog's not getting harmed, they're not being penetrated, and it's not bad for society. We're seeing that it's actually decreasing stress, decreasing anxiety, and with, people that are not able to find relationships in sexual encounters with another person. So this is decreasing their anxiety. It's not harming society. It's not harming the dog. I mean, it seems from like the standards that you're giving, like
mhm.
we would have to be okay with it.
I think the theist runs into the same problem, which is, well, if God said that that's what we had to do.
That's not true though, because that's divine command theory, which Catholics deny. We don't believe that if God declared X, it would make X true.
Yeah, so in the same way that Catholics sort of get out of the hypothetical by having this metaethical theory and the ontology of God and this esoteric and supremely complicated epistemology of how we know that, is the same way in which a Catholic can dodge the question because it's like, well, God wouldn't say that because that's divine command theory, is the same thing, right? Like, well, if something was good, then would it be good? Is sort of it's not the supreme gotcha, because if the Catholic Church said, and we knew, if we infallibly knew that it was an infallible statement, that we now had the moral obligation to do the thing of which you're describing, we'd be in the same quagmire as if all of science updated and biology changed on its head. It's people sort of to bring it back to the original conversation on gay marriage. It's like, yeah, if somebody came up to me and proved to me that that being gay was going to be a problem for me in every possible way, and that the more stable way to be truly fulfilled and live a fully actualized life was to go back to being a celibate, same-sex attracted Catholic. It's like, yeah, like I followed the study, and the same thing, like if a study showed that conversion therapy did work, which it's that science has overwhelmingly shown that it does not work, counter to some narratives in the Catholic world. But like if conversion therapy did work, and science updated to show that being gay was the worst thing on planet Earth, and that being straight was the best thing on planet Earth, then it's like, yeah, then it sort of becomes straight in this sort of theoretical world. But I don't know if these bone chilling counterfactuals are gotchas for anyone across any sort of moral or ethical theory, or theistic or non-theistic, or some derivation of that. Um, because if you say, right, like God wouldn't command that, then I can say, well, the science won't show that. And we're both sort of at this sort of ethical counterfactual impasse about a purely in theory, non in praxis moral consideration.
So I would just disagree with that because I would say that our reason as Catholics for like why that would never be commanded is because it is grounded in a sort of objective realism of what the sexual act is intended for versus your reasoning
But
seems to be
could God
coming
have
from.
intended something else? Right? Could God have made the telos of the sexual faculties so as to allow for the theoretical that you're talking about?
Yes. But that would
That's what I'm saying.
change
We're both in the same
that would change
quagmire.
the ethos of it though.
Mhm. And that's exactly what I'm saying too. Which is, I don't think that these are gotchas because, and also it's a technical side point for the audience listening. You can have moral realism without God. It's not sort of with God you have objectivity, without God you have subjectivity, which is often confused with a perspective or,
Yeah.
but it's a separate discussion, which is like, yeah, could God have designed the world so that the theoretical that you're talking about is good? Yes. And that's sort of like a gotcha, but I in the same way that if an atheist sort of did a gotcha on you like that, I'd be like, yeah, but you sort of like flipped the entire equation on its head, so it doesn't actually illustrate anything, is the same way in which if we talk about this theoretical 200 years from now, I don't think that that has anything to say about the current ethical propositions that I'm putting out there, because it entirely changes the equation, and the world that we're living in. Because it's just like, well, if it's good, then is it good? It's sort of a tautological gotcha that somebody might be able to clip, but I don't think actually provides cogent and salient points for ethical considerations.
Okay, sorry. I want to clarify what I
Mhm.
meant, just so that I'm being as explicit as possible. So God could have designed the sexual act to be different than it is, right? We like there are church fathers that posit we could have made babies without having sex, period, right? So there could be a world where like I don't know, we get to the end in a different manner, but in terms of like is there a possible world where it is okay to derive sexual pleasure from an animal? I would say no. There is no possible world where God could have designed it so that could be true. And
Why would that be?
in the same way that God couldn't have designed a world where 2 + 2 = 5.
So the mathematical and the ethical are sort of two very different worlds, because sort of 2 by 2 by definition is 4. We're talking about pure mathematics. When it comes to the ethical considerations, though, God surely could have created a world, if he is all powerful, in which the telos of particular acts now are the opposite of what they could be, right? God would have to
No.
be all powerful.
No, because we don't define the ethics of something just simply on the effects. I think that's what you're thinking. I mean, because that's where you're
But God
coming from.
But as a truth claim, if we take moral realism as the sort of like factoid about the world that is stance independent, we would have to say that God could have entirely redesigned the world in a way in which the proposition that you bring up is the right solution, not because of the effects. It's not like God's changing the effects, but it is the very nature of teloi to have been something different. Right? We can't say that because it's a counterfactual, it's not possible unless we admit on both sides of the conversation that that counterfactuals aren't always the most stable and illustrative way to evaluate a moral system.
So I, you're losing me. I'm going to be honest,
Mhm.
but I'm going to say if you asked me, could God have made it so that stabbing somebody in the head, for like innocent person that was good? And my response to that would be no. But like, let's say by stabbing somebody in the head, like there's a possible world where like me stabbing you in the head is actually like injecting you with like greater health or something. Then like, okay, maybe like, but that would change the very nature of the act that we're talking about. Does that make sense? So
Mhm.
if the very nature of the thing remained, then no, there is no possible world where God could command it to be good and it would be so.
Yeah, so that's where we have to do a separate 2-hour conversation on stance independence, and the epistemology of particular metaethical theories and how those get applied, and then the ontology of moral acts. And then we're going to have a conversation around what the metaethical theories have to say about these particular acts. And you're right to point out that these are infinitely complex. And so we're sort of at an impasse where we can go deep into ethics. Like we can talk about this for a long time. We can also move it into some of the other questions, because I
Yeah.
can talk ethics for way too many hours on road trips.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
up to you on where you want to see
Yes.
things.
Yes. No, let's continue. Okay. So question 8, maybe we gotta, this is my fault because I was derailing us, but we have 3 more. So
Perfect.
let's try to roll through these. And I think these are a lot simpler. Why do you think so many Gen Zers are drawn towards Catholicism, especially the more traditional rites?
I think that everyone in life is looking for meaning, in a very Jordan Peterson type of way, that there's facts about the world, but we don't live by facts. We live by stories and archetypes, and we move through life. We are, life is not a plane of existence, it's a forum for action, which is a technical way of saying, like, knowing science doesn't, in a certain sense, make your life better. Like, we want to have lives of profound meaning. And I think what religion provides is a very stable way to have a meaningful life. I don't think that religion it sort of makes a meaningful life, because it's sort of meaning that's going to be a very separate discussion. But I think we are all searching for a meaningful life. And I think historic religions are a very stable way to get there, a sort of just add water approach to meaning and morality and all of these things. And I think Gen Z has rightly pointed out that you can't sort of rip away traditional religion and replace it with nothing in this place. Like, we want something to belong to. That belief and belonging are synonymous, and we want to go through the world and be joyful, amazing people that can make sense of the world. And I think Catholicism provides a lot of very strict definitions to meaning and purpose in life. That when somebody is young and feels lost and isn't sure of themselves, you have an identity right at the Catholic Church. Like, I found my identity very quickly in Catholicism. But I think, and it's also in a very traditional sense, I was that young people want to be zealous. Young people want to fight and give the finger to the older generations. Young people want to solve the world's problems. And I think the Latin Mass does that for a lot of people. I remember being part of this zealous, on-fire movement, clashing with my local pastor, knowing the local auxiliary bishop who knew that I was introducing his nephew to the Latin Mass. It's you have a fight, and we are creatures of meaning and survival. But also the Latin Mass is a young American phenomena. That just because it's compelling in an American context does not mean that in Botswana the answer is Taylor Marshall. The Latin Mass might be compelling, but the answer is not that the grandma from El Salvador is going to be just wowed by the Tantum Ergo. Right? There's so many complicated things that I think there is so much good in what people are searching for. My only caution as I wrap up this long-winded answer to a short question is that the big questions about life are ones that we're always searching for. And an answer is not the same as a real answer. And that we must continually check the compelling answers with the world out there, and not let this sense of wonder and awe about the world that led us to Catholicism allow us to stay trapped and enact harm on other people because they don't see the world the same way. And I think that's one of the reasons why I left Catholicism, is that I think those big questions are so important. And I wanted to keep searching for them beyond the ready-made, just add water answers that I think I was taught when I was Catholic.
Wow, that's beautiful. When you were talking about that, and just like in general, I think this conversation, the image that comes to my mind is Jacob wrestling with God.
Mhm.
And how in you, I see a lot of that. I see a lot of wrestling. And I think for some people, when they're faced with these big questions and this tension, they feel the need to run away and to hide. But there's other people who feel the need to push deeper and wrestle. And I respect you a lot for it. Really, I think it's very admirable. So, um,
I
okay,
appreciate it.
of course. I would love to just do an episode with you where we talk about the dangers of the traditionalism in
Yeah.
Catholicism, because oh gosh, I think that'd be a funny collab. That would really make them mad, me collabing with an atheist or an agnostic or whatever you are,
Mhm.
to talk about that.
And that'd be a fascinating episode because I also have plenty of things to say about how even left wing political ideology or atheism can fall prey to fundamentalism, which I don't think
Yeah,
fundamentalism is a left or a right issue or even a
yeah,
centrist issue. Which would be fascinating comparing notes on the Latin Mass. And also, in many ways, there's times where I've gone to left wing events and they feel like going back to church because they fall into the same fundamentalist tendencies that are innate to our psychology that
yeah.
must be cautioned against, regardless of sort of the intellectual proposition that we must be aware of sort of how cult dynamics work.
I would
Could be a fun
love
collab.
that. I would love that. That would be phenomenal. Okay. Question 9. So would you call yourself an agnostic or an atheist?
The technical position would be igtheism, which is to say that the terms and ideas that we use around the divine are so uncertain and ambiguous that we can't have knowledge claims of certainty about the supernatural. I use the term atheist as shorthand.
Okay.
Even though my thoughts are much more complicated than that, I
Yeah.
don't ever want to lead people on to think that I'm something that I'm not. I was doing a collab, which might be out by the time this episode is out, with another Catholic YouTuber on going to a bunch of churches, and I can appreciate and oftentimes look like a Christian or pay lip service to it, but I mean it in a very atheistic way. Even though like I don't think atheism is a thing, I don't think atheism is a worldview. I still find it important to use that label so as to not confuse people
Yeah.
and sell too many books around something that I am indeed not.
Awesome. Okay. Glad you clarified. I would love to look more into that because I've never heard of that before. So, is your iggtheism related to your sexuality? Do you believe that your sexuality is incompatible with belief in God?
No, I know a number of tremendously devout Protestants and Christians and Orthodox Christians and all across the spectrum who are either living happy, healthy lives out and proud, or people who are living lives of celibacy and see no qualm between their sexuality, sexual orientation, and or their religious persuasion. I do say that sort of my sexuality and being gay allowed me to, or forced me to make a decision on these big questions and sort of is a microscope looking at particular moral considerations where I didn't deconvert because I thought that the church was wrong on homosexuality, but that having to come to a concrete moral decision on that allowed me to build the framework to deconstruct overall. That wasn't just, I don't like that the church says that this is wrong, I'm going to leave. But rather, how is it that we get to moral decisions? How is it that the church teaches? And it was those questions that made me go, oh, like maybe there's more here. I lived life as a celibate, same-sex attracted Catholic for many years, devout in it. I wasn't living some crazy secondary lifestyle. I wanted to become a traditional Catholic priest. So many things that are there. And so it's a lifestyle that I have lived. It's not one that I think is the worst thing on planet Earth, but I am reasonably certain that the moral dictates of the current magisterium, of the thing that we know as the Catholic Church, do not necessarily correspond to the ethical theories that are out there in the world, which is a very long-winded technical response to. It made me. I think sometimes straight Catholics often can sort of live in this ambiguity about the world because you can sort of you're dating somebody of the opposite sex, you might slip and fall into sin, but like you don't have to reevaluate the entire relationship in theory. You can sort of go to confession and sort of make amends and keep going. But as someone with same-sex attraction, it's either not at all, or in many ways the church doesn't want you, and sort of you're out of the church. So I think it's that same-sex sexuality forced me to make very precise moral pronouncements and it made me make very clear moral statements. Unfortunately, because would I still be Catholic if I was straight? The chances are probably higher than my current state, being gay, but it certainly wasn't leading over that per se.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, last question.
Hmm.
And I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to get going in like 2 minutes.
You're totally
But
good.
do you ever miss being Catholic?
There are elements that I miss to the culture, to the spirituality, and to the people. But I have not missed the magisterial and epistemological approaches of Catholicism and what that has to say about my life. I tend now to see religion much more as culture, as spirituality, as meaning making. I think like pre-2015, Jordan Peterson was right about nearly everything. And so I see religion, it's slightly different now. And so the parts that I do miss about Catholicism are the ones that do not point inherently to a supernatural God. But yes, it was my entire life. And I think anybody would be lying if they say they don't miss parts of their past life, even if they are glad that they have left a relationship or gone to a different major in college or tried a new job. We will always miss different things. But that is certainly not an indication that I am on my way back to Rome and will cross the Tiber anytime soon, except for making YouTube content.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I really enjoyed this. This was wonderful, and you're such a great person to get to know. So, yeah, thank you for taking the time to answer my I felt like I was interrogating you, but you
Yeah.
have great responses, so I loved hearing them all.
It has been a blast being on. I've followed your stuff for a while, and I'm glad that we finally got the chance to sit down and talk. I found conversations are way less scary when we get people on calls versus, like
Yep.
the stitch culture of TikTok is like infinite responses. I super value knowing people like you having these great conversations, and hopefully people of any persuasion can learn a thing or two or Google whatever was said halfway through at the 35-minute mark and learn something so that these conversations can be fruitful for us and for the world at large with all of our
Amazing.
limited time. So it's been a blast.
Awesome. Yes, thank you so much. And then do you want to just plug your socials really quick so people can
Mhm.
find you?
Yeah, if you look up Cade Bradley or my handle's at GayXTrad, and then I also run the Intrinsically Ordered podcast, which luckily, if you search that up, you will not find any other podcast with a remotely similar name. So sometimes Google that. If you're uncertain what I said as my username, just Google Intrinsically Ordered and you'll find your way back to my main accounts.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right.